Yeah, so, and the way in which sort of leaned into it, like, are you did you hear my? Oh, yeah, he told you that. Yeah, the night shakes, like that, yeah. The thing that I have to make her really into the public eye. I don't know. I think, I bet she's very pleased with what. Guys, thank you so much.
Yeah, so
What do you
I thought about majoring in journalism when I was in college. Yeah, but I went a different way. Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh,
I get what it is. It's not K-bar, but it's not much above that. Oh, it doesn't matter. Sure. They're probably in the 60s. They're kind of mild print all over the hall. Yeah, Paisley. See, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought those were just fancy circles. Yes, many. Well, I'll be done. No, I think I've already learned something. I can leave now, but I'm not. No, I think my third grade picture was taken that shirt. Well, that's what we thought. Speaking of our tires. They're what?
Ferguson.
Mm-hmm.
Stop. Yeah.
Keep your feet warm. You can pour liquid in them. Yeah. Throw it around. They were being a little round.
Yeah.
No. What's the meaning?
I think
Oh, I was trying to control the soft. It's rowdy anyway. What is rowdy?
I did consider it, and then I thought, you know, it's better. And it really, yeah, we have just two dogs and like. Also, isn't it someone else, when your partner is in conference all the time, when you go there and you're just all by yourself? Yeah, we'll do not fun. Some of them, but you know, my dad does not want to get it. Really meditate, meditate on paper.
And you're teaching a class on Buddhism. What college students like?
But I think I'm happy to talk about it after this. Sorry.
Not bad.
No worries. So welcome everybody. Tonight is the first in what I hope will be a long series of Dewey Dialogues public lectures. One of the things that I was really keen to do when I was brought in last year to head up the Center for Dewey Studies is to start a series of events that went beyond the academic focus, which is of course central to a lot of the work we do, and had a real significant public outreach element to it that was concerned with continuing the legacy of John Dewey, himself an important public intellectual, public philosopher, and the many kinds of projects that he cared deeply about. In his 1927 classic, The Public and Its Problems, Dewey analyzed the nature of democracy and the role of both public and experts in democracy. And he came to the conclusion that the nature of communication, the sharing of information through the media, and the various modes of communication between members of the public were crucial to a healthy, functioning democracy. That's why I'm excited to introduce our speaker tonight, who's going to talk to us about the importance of journalism in democracy and the concept of news literacy. Alee Quick is the Director of Civic Engagement at the News Literacy Project. She is formerly an editor at the Southern Illinoisan, and also a former employee of SIU. She worked for a while at the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute in their communications and marketing. Also, if you don't know, she's also a trivia host at Hangar 9 on Wednesdays, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And I'm now going to turn over the floor to Alee Quick to tell us about news literacy.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this topic. I have one of those jobs that's kind of hard to explain, and when I try to explain it, nobody knows what I'm saying. So I appreciate all the friendly faces here as well who probably don't want to try to have that conversation with me anymore. So today I'm going to talk about what is news literacy, why should we care about news literacy, and how do we know what to believe? Or at least we're going to peel back the first layer of the onion of how to know what to believe, because it is very complicated, but we will see what we can do. Thank you for the introduction. A little bit more about me. I'm the Director of Civic Engagement for the News Literacy Project, as Matt said. What that means is that I manage our organizational partnerships. We're partnered with civic organizations like the AARP, League of Women Voters, National Institute for Civil Discourse, Braver Angels, which works in the depolarization space, and a lot more. So I seek these partnerships, and then once we get them, make sure that we maintain them and that we're serving these audiences and their members the best that we can. I plan events. We do small custom training for companies and those civic clubs, civic organizations. Also, we do bigger events that are open to the public. Earlier today, we had a webinar that had about 500 people attend. And I'll tell you all a little bit more about that later because we're doing it again. So if you missed it, you can come on November 16th to our next one. I also work on promotions. So I promote all of our resources that we make for adults. The News Literacy Project makes curriculum for elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, and more recently for independent learners or people outside of a traditional classroom. So that is part of my job as well. And yes, previously at the Southern. So if we want to talk about local journalism later, I can do that. Paul Simon Institute for a bit. And I moved here originally to work for M River. They build the river models. I do host trivia at Hangar 9, and I am in the band Squid Whip, which is playing in the Shark Museum next Monday. So lots of opportunity to see me. Okay, so let's talk about news literacy. At the News Literacy Project, we seek to teach people how to think about news and information, not what to think about any particular source or piece of information. We are working to help people develop a healthy skepticism about news and information, not cynicism. We don't think cynicism is beneficial in the long run, but we do need healthy skepticism. We also have baked into our curriculum a dedication to the First Amendment and understanding the importance of a free press in a democracy. And of course, that's some of what we'll talk about today. My organization itself, our mission is that we are a national education nonprofit. So we're around the country. I still live and work here in Carbondale, thankfully. But we serve the country, and I have colleagues all over the place. We're in Canada, Hawaii, DC, Chicago, we're everywhere. And we're even in rural Iowa. So that's another thing. Although it seems like a national organization that has an office in DC would be, kind of preferential to big cities. I work there. I have colleagues who live on farms in rural towns, and yeah, so we're all over. But basically what we do is we provide programs and resources for educators and the public to teach, learn, and share the abilities needed to be smart, active consumers of news and information, and equal and engaged participants in a democracy. And we have a very big vision. We want news literacy to be embedded in the American education experience and in American life. We want news literacy to become a national movement similar to the movement against drunk driving, smoking. We think that this is a public need, and so that's part of our vision. We were founded 15 years ago by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist named Alan Miller. He visited his daughter's middle school classroom to talk about his job and realized that none of those middle schoolers knew what journalists did, and thought it was really important that the next generation knows what journalism is so that we can continue this great American tradition. So he founded the News Literacy Project. And so for our first several years, the focus was on, like I said, creating that curriculum for middle and high school students. 2020 happened. We had the pandemic. We had a contentious election. We had January 6th, which happened obviously in 2021, but as a result of the 2020 election. And so my organization kind of grew to include these independent learners that I mentioned, adults, seniors, people in their workplace, Rotary clubs, places like that. Yes, so we're going to talk about the connection to a healthy democracy. Information is the basis for civic literacy, agency, and action. This is the most simple and basic reason for why news literacy is important and is important to a democracy. When I walk into the voting booth next year, am I making my decisions about candidates or issues based on facts, reality, or have I been manipulated by embellishment, lies, or even hoaxes? News literacy helps people make sound decisions on matters of self-governance because it gives them the skills to think critically about the information that's coming at them. And there's a lot of information coming at us, as we all know. Social progress requires healthy discourse. We don't seek to eliminate disagreement when we talk about media literacy and news literacy. We're seeking accurate disagreement, which we think helps us find common ground. We can and should disagree on matters of policy. We should disagree about solutions to the problems that we face, but we should be able to acknowledge what our problems are based on solid reasoning that is grounded in reality, or in other words, a shared set of facts. And we need to prioritize credible sources to protect ourselves from misinformation. We're all vulnerable. Nobody in this room can say without lying that we have not been fooled by an AI-generated image or a false claim we saw on Facebook or Instagram, or even satire. That one's got me before. And we all need the skills to protect ourselves and our communities. The founder of my organization, who I mentioned earlier, Alan Miller, wrote in a column for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, "A central challenge is the long decline in trust in key institutions that provide vital information and services that Americans rely on for much of their public life. And this has left many unsure of whom or what to trust, and thus prone to not trusting any sources as independent and reliable arbiters of fact-based reality." That's that cynicism I mentioned earlier that we seek to avoid when we teach news literacy. And last year, during National News Literacy Week, I wrote in an op-ed, in part, that the acceptance of facts is central to productive discourse and the functioning of our institutions. And when we cannot agree on a common set of facts and credible sources, cynicism cascades into distrust of institutions, decision makers, and governing bodies. And the result is a weaker democracy. A perfect example of this is January 6th, which I mentioned earlier. That cynicism led to distrust in our institutions in the election, in Congress and its role and resulted in real violence. People lost their lives, people were seriously injured, and many people are going to prison. So it's very real. Okay, let's talk about something heartwarming. I was informed recently that the Gen Z people in my life didn't know who these people were, but those of us millennials, Xers, and boomers know that this is Mr. Rogers and Steve Irwin, the crocodile guy, whatever his name is, I forget. Anyway, there are some wholesome characters from our childhood, right? Or maybe our children's childhoods. And Mr. Rogers is wearing that Bob Ross t-shirt, says good vibes only. There's even a rainbow in the background. I look at this and I am feeling so, like my heart is so warm right now. This is two beloved characters. I didn't even know that they met each other. And what is that t-shirt? I need that. This is awesome. News literacy teaches us that seeing something like this might want to raise a few red flags. And we will talk about some of those red flags in a minute. But unfortunately, this is not real. This is a composite image based on a few different images, and it is not legitimate. And this might seem relatively harmless, right? This is kind of funny, it's warm, whatever. I'm not being radicalized by this photo, right? But a photoshopped image of Mr. Rogers, Steve Irwin, and the ghostly apparition of Bob Ross do have something to do with democracy. These seemingly harmless online gags can be a door to believing more harmful falsehoods. And the same tactics that created this silly Photoshop and allowed it to go viral also created some more dangerous things. This is a post from my organization's website called Rumor Guard. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but basically it's a platform where we use viral hoaxes to highlight patterns in misinformation so that we can kind of learn to recognize them in the future. But what's happening here is that videos were spreading on social media a couple of weeks ago that supposedly showed people vanishing into thin air. School buses were suddenly empty of children. Postal workers delivering mail suddenly disappeared in these videos, but they're not real. They're out of context, dramatic reenactments, or enactments, I should say, of what might happen during a supposed rapture. And maybe this is not causing anyone to act irrationally just yet, but it's starting to pull on some emotions, right? We also have this, a false claim that CNN staged a war report, which uses altered audio. A post like this is breeding distrust in a standards-based legitimate news outlet. And we have this, a Twitter or X post that claims that election workers can overturn election results due to some clause in some software company contract. And it's false. And this is breeding distrust in one of our most vital institutions, of course, our elections. So while the Mr. Rogers and Steve Irwin photo is activating different emotions than posts like these, it's still activating emotions. And we'll come back to this later, but emotional manipulation is one thing that we talk about a lot. That's a factor in spreading misinformation and deepening those divides. So part of what I want to do is explain to you all what news literacy is. I think maybe we're familiar with terms like digital literacy, information literacy, media literacy. I think the best way to get into news literacy itself is to briefly go through some things that we might teach in a lesson that we might give. So if you'll forgive those of you who are here who may feel that this is a little elementary, I do want to just give you a taste of some news literacy. So let's talk about that. What is news and what makes a source credible? News informs through fair and impartial reporting about local, national, and international events, issues, and people of significance or of interest. Simple enough. When we talk about how to evaluate whether something is a legitimate source or a reliable source, we like to start with the 7 standards of quality journalism. And we'll go through them. So first of all, quality journalism uses multiple credible sources. These are people in a position to know relevant facts and details. They can be eyewitnesses, officials, experts, academics, and sometimes controversially, unnamed sources. When you see an unnamed source in a standards-based news report, typically that unnamed source will be known to the journalist and at least one editor. We are not just running with secret tips from secret people. We might get secret tips from secret people, but before those ever make it into a news report, there's a lot of other things that has to happen. And usually it'll be multiple credible sources is a place to start. Another place to go is documentation, of course. These are, of course, documents, images, video, any form of raw information. We see reports, studies, data, audio recordings, and many of you are probably familiar with FOIA. That is our state law that allows us to seek documents that are a matter of public record. We need verification. Verification is the essence of journalism. That comes from the elements of journalism, which is kind of like our Bible. It's a set of practices to get details of an event confirmed by those multiple sources, designed to ensure accuracy. Sometimes if you are talking to a person, you might get that documentation. So you've got number one, multiple sources, number two, documents that back up what the sources tell you. And that's all part of the verification process. That brings us to number three. And journalists are responsible for ensuring that their facts are accurate. And sometimes they're checked by editors. We know that local news is struggling. There have been a lot of staff cuts at papers and stations and places that are standards-based news outlets. Local news is struggling. I think we all know that, and we can talk more about that if y'all want at the end. But I bring that up to say that typically we want editors to check what reporters are reporting, but the reality these days is that that doesn't always happen. And sometimes reporters are responsible for verifying their own reporting. And that's, you know, just the reality of life in 2023, unfortunately. We talk about fairness, kind of a buzzword that can be misused or misunderstood, but in news literacy, when we talk about fairness, we talk about treating sources with respect. We talk about giving subjects a chance to share their point of view. When a story mentions a person, especially if it's making an allegation about a person, it should always seek comment from that person. They should always have an opportunity to respond to whatever allegation or assertion is being made about them. And then there's, of course, balance. We seek balance by accurately presenting all relevant sides of a story. We present opposing viewpoints impartially and accurately, but not necessarily equally. Some people may be familiar with the term both sidesism. We don't think that that's balance. And ultimately, journalists need to go where evidence takes them. Their reporting should be transparent about that, which is really important. A perfect example would be climate change. The preponderance of the evidence shows that it's real and it's caused by people, and journalists do a disservice if they present it as unsettled science, because it's pretty well settled. So when we talk about balance, we don't talk about just giving equal time to two sides or three sides or whatever of a story. We talk about, you know, context. We talk about context. When we talk about context, we are thinking about presenting facts in a way that makes their meaning clear, fair, and accurate. Of course, a really good example is, you know, these videos online that you may see that take quotes out of context, right? So you can chop up anything anyone says to make them say anything. Standards-based news outlets will never do such a thing. You're getting the full context, the meaning of whatever statement is being made, whatever information is being shared. And then one that we love to talk about, that everybody loves to talk about, is bias, media bias. When we avoid bias, we are attempting to present facts and context in a dispassionate manner. And when we question bias, we have to think about news. And that means differentiating news from other types of information and content. Articles that are presented as opinion and commentary should contain bias and should reflect a viewpoint. And that's not always a bad thing. But when we talk about news, we want to avoid bias. people love to talk about news media bias, so I'm going to talk about that a little further. Let's see. Well, sorry. This is what I want to talk about, the media bias chart. In the study of media literacy, this comes up a lot. And I'm sure people here have seen something like this. Yeah, the media bias chart. So what we've got here is, a chart that shows this certain news organization leans left, center, or right. But my organization has a little more context to provide to discussing media bias like this. We think that media bias charts are inherently based on perception of the people who put them together and are therefore open to debate and interpretation. Depending on where I sit on the political spectrum, I might see one news outlet as being far right and another as far left, and you might be sitting in a different place on the political spectrum and see it the exact opposite. So we think that these are kind of subject to the opinion of whoever's put them together. And maybe not the opinion, but the interpretation of whoever has put them together. They often reflect the opinion and commentary of a given news organization, not news reporting. Chicago Tribune is a well-respected, standards-based news outlet. Their opinion page tends to lean to the right. If you read their editorial board's op-eds, you'll notice that, likely. Again, depending on where you sit in the political spectrum. Maybe to you they seem center or they seem left, but they often kind of seem to fall into line in one ideology. But that does not make their reporting necessarily biased in one way or another. That's just the opinion of their editorial board. We also think that media bias charts present a false equivalence between standards-based news outlets and more partisan sources. We've got the Associated Press on here with OAN, Newsmax, Democracy Now, and Alternate. I don't know, do all of these organizations belong on one chart? Is that kind of fairly representing the goal of each of these organizations? I would say that they don't. They also suggest that most newsrooms have an ideological goal. And it also reinforces the idea of the media as a kind of monolith. Like I said, these different organizations have different goals. And, we can talk about defining the word media, but we don't think that these places all can be judged on one spectrum. So we seek a more nuanced approach when we talk about bias that goes into kind of a better understanding of different types of bias and forms of bias. It's not just political. There can be demographic bias, neutrality bias that kind of plays into some of that issue of fairness and balance that we talked about earlier, big story bias, corporate bias. There's also framing, tone, absence of fairness and balance, flawed sourcing. There's just a lot more that goes into it. Accountability and transparency are also extremely, extremely important for standards-based news outlets. We seek to show our work. What do we know? How do we know it? Sometimes that means saying what we don't know. And it means issuing a correction when a mistake is made and explaining why a correction is being issued, no matter how small. Yesterday, the New York Times released an editor's note on their coverage of the hospital explosion near a hospital in Gaza. And I think this is like a perfect example of this accountability and transparency that standards-based news outlets will go for. They said that they did not make clear that claims could not immediately be verified and that their report left readers with incorrect impressions. And this was, from a couple of weeks ago. And so the information was out there, but they sought to be accountable and transparent about what happened and why it happened by releasing this editor's note. I just saw this the other day and thought, wow, that illustrates that perfectly. We also want to disclose relationships between news organizations and subjects of stories. You'll notice on NPR, they might say, Facebook is a funder, or in the Washington Post, they might remind you that Jeff Bezos owns the post when they're reporting on Amazon, for example. So that's another kind of green flag. So that's a little bit about what makes something a standards-based news outlet. And now that we know that, why are we still susceptible to misinformation? Confirmation bias plays a big role. It feels good to find information that confirms what we already believe. Misinformation also manipulates our emotions. That's something that I'll talk about a little bit more. Sometimes the information we find calms our fears and anxieties, whether it's true or not. And conspiracy belief can also connect us to a community, can feel like belonging. But most importantly, and most basically, misinformation relies on emotional manipulation to spread. We talk about emotional reasoning, where we form or evaluate a conclusion based on whether something feels true. On the other hand, we have rational reasoning, where we evaluate evidence, facts, and assumptions to determine if a conclusion is supported logically, even if that makes us feel bad. And any emotion can be manipulated. Anger, fear, sadness are pretty obvious ones that get manipulated, but humor is an emotion that can manipulate us, and so is hope, and so is nostalgia. And misinformation is designed to elicit a strong emotional response. Again, whether that's a negative or a positive emotion, that's pretty much always the case. And when our emotion centers are going over time, they're elevated over our rational thought. And again, we especially respond to things that feel true. So in news literacy, we teach 3 essential skills. One is critical observation, one is lateral reading, and another is reverse image searching. They're just kind of the most basic little fact-checking skills that you can walk away with. So we're back to Mr. Rogers and Steve Irwin. A good place to start here is critical observation. So what does that mean? It means taking a moment to pause, taking a moment to feel our feelings, recognize that a strong emotion is a red flag, and maybe take a look at this and make some notes, right? Is there anything that stands out to anyone when you look at this? Obviously, I've already told you that it's not real, but if I hadn't, anybody want to say what they noticed about this? Yeah, go ahead. Okay, it's weird that there's a rainbow in the background. That's good. Yeah.
Based off of what I recall on Mr. Rogers, I find it hard to believe that he would not be dressed out wearing a button shirt.
Okay, hard to believe he would be out in public without his button-up shirt. One more. Yeah, the shadows look different. Yeah, so they don't really look like they were photographed in the same light. So, okay, that's your first news literacy skill, critical observation. Yeah, one more.
I think the thing that really sells it is the t-shirt looks pasted on.
T-shirt looks pasted on.
T-shirt just looks totally pasted on.
This looks kind of fakey.
Fit in all. It looks so photoshopped.
Yeah, these are all great little examples of critical observation. So congrats, your first news literacy skill down pat. Another thing we can do, so now that we've observed these things that seem off, is that we can use lateral reading to verify information. Lateral reading is basically just opening another browser tab to look for other sources. Let's see what we might find out about Steve Irwin and Mr. Rogers. Were they ever hanging out together? We can verify those details, look for credibility of the source. We may even find where this photo came from originally. The example I showed you was a tweet or an X post. But where did that come from originally? And when we look at multiple sources, we can be more confident in credibility of what we're reading or not. We can say, that looks not good. So another thing we can do is use a reverse image search. I thought I would quickly, if you all will indulge me, show you a couple of ways that you can go about that. So I've got a copy of this image and I've put it into Google. You can click on, there's a little camera that came up and it let me upload a photo. And so that's what I've done. And so on the right here, we're seeing some results. Not great ones 100% of the time. Google lets us kind of zoom in a little bit on this image and we'll see what might come up. Okay, well, this is a big red flag right here. We see this, that is from a fact checking site that says false. So in this case, my reverse image search pretty much brought me my answer right away. This takes us to a Snopes article. Is this a pic of Steve Irwin hanging out with Mr. Rogers in a Bob Ross t-shirt? And this person, who is actually now my colleague at the News Literacy Project, Dan, has gone through the trouble of looking this up, finding the origin, and it's all right here for you. But there's a couple other ways we can go about it. There's also a site called TinEye where we can upload images, and let's just see if we get anything different. So we get a lot of results from Tumblr, Reddit, you know, again, user-generated stuff, not any reputable news outlets. And then the cool thing about TinEye that I like is that we can go to most changed. So if I suspect that this could be photoshopped, and I'm glad that this comes up because somebody mentioned, oh, would Mr. Rogers be out, you know, without his button-up shirt? And it appears that he was, but this is not the Bob Ross t-shirt. This looks really, really similar to the picture of him where he's pointing, but that is not the t-shirt that we're seeing, right? We're seeing something else. So that's another way that we have used reverse image searching to do that. Oh no, did I lose my place? I might have. That's okay. We're live. Okay. And then I mentioned lateral reading earlier, so I want to show you what that might look like too. Basically, I just want to open another tab in Google search. And so I put in Steve Irwin, Mr. Rogers, just to see, were they ever hanging out together? Did they know each other? And the first thing that comes up is that USA Today fact check. And again, the Snopes post, which we've already looked at. Again, the nice thing about Snopes is that they kind of go through everything. They have found the actual source where it was originally posted. This is a meme account that just does photoshopped images. If you visit this Instagram account, you'll see Kurt Cobain hanging out with Betty White and just like random celebrities together. Odd pairings is kind of what they specialize in. And then they've also found the same origin image that we found when we looked on TinEye and kind of driven that back to its source. And here we have all of the originals kind of put together. So this was originally a photo of Steve Irwin with his arm around his dad. And like his dad has been replaced by this photo of Mr. Rogers. And we added Bob Ross just like for good measure and the rainbow, just so you know it's really BS. Okay, so now that you know how to fact check very quickly and simply, a big question, do we have to fact check everything? I mean, gosh, sometimes I just want to scroll and not really think about it, right? I say fact check before you share something. Do you have to fact check absolutely everything that you look at? Maybe not, but before you share it with someone else, please fact check, especially if it's something you just found on social media. If you feel unsure or skeptical about something, that's a great indication that you should open another tab and Google it or try that reverse image search. Again, if you're using critical observation, that's kind of leading you to this conclusion of, okay, I'm feeling skeptical. If something is connecting to a deeply held belief for you, again, triggering any of those really strong emotions, that's a great indication that you should fact check something. But there's also the critical skill of ignoring. We have to invest our brain power in quality information, and we don't have the time to police everyone. We have our kind of spheres of influence where we can make a difference. We have parents, children we can talk to about these things, but we don't have to be going around every single post we see and, you know, reminding people that they're wrong. You know, as much as possible, use your brain energy in a constructive way. Having, you know, a productive conversation with a loved one, I think is a good way to go about it. But before you like or share, just pause, take a minute, be aware of your emotions, do a quick check. Remember to ask yourself, is it news? Is this coming from a standards-based news outlet or from a random meme account on Instagram? And here we are making a plug for my organization. You can learn more about us at newslit.org. We have a newsletter that goes out weekly that has these kind of timely examples. We have a whole post about the editor's note that I mentioned earlier from the New York Times, kind of explaining why they did that, how it relates to news literacy, what you can learn about that. So that's what you'll see in our newsletter. We have a podcast where we interview experts, journalists about their work. We have those webinars that I mentioned earlier. And then we also have Rumor Guard, which I briefly mentioned. This is our platform that, again, uses those kind of viral hoaxes, viral pieces of misinformation to show you common patterns in misinformation that should help you in the future kind of recognize those. Each post evaluates information based on 5 factors for credibility: authenticity, source, evidence, context, which we talked about a lot, and reasoning. And it will kind of give you this takeaway. And so what I've learned from since we launched Rumor Guard last year are these patterns that, when you see a piece of viral misinformation, it will adhere to a common pattern. These bad actors, people creating and sharing misinformation, are not very inventive. They're kind of all doing the same thing. So once you learn to recognize one, you can kind of recognize it again in the future. Back to democracy. Is there any reason to hope despite all of this? We think that there is. Obviously, that's what we're here for. So yeah, my answer is probably pretty predictable. But I want to bring it back to what my founder, the founder of the News Literacy Project, Alan, wrote in that Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists op-ed. American people are not as polarized as social media, especially Twitter and the news media, often make them appear. And political commentator David French wrote, polling has shown that 2/3 of Americans from across the political spectrum are fed up with polarization, forgotten in public discourse, flexible in their views, and still believe we can find common ground. And the hope is that some of these exhausted Americans will find the energy to rally to fight back against the rising toxic tide of false and harmful content. So that's what we're here for. And one more little plug. On November 16th, we are hosting, in collaboration with the National Institute for Civil Discourse and the League of Women Voters of the United States, a webinar about how to have productive conversations about misinformation and political difference. So we had our first session today, earlier this afternoon, and it was a great discussion. I learned a lot. The holidays are coming and an election season is coming. So it's good to be prepared for how we're going to talk to our crazy uncles or whoever that character in your life may be about these things. So thank you very much for listening, and I will be happy to take any questions.
Okay, we have plenty of time for questions. If you raise your hand, I'll bring you the microphone so everybody can hear your question. This is my little way of getting a workout at the end of the day.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. And I think it helps too to think about where does the funding for the organization come from as well. I found like if it's like the American network of blank, 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 you can go research it online and say, who donates the money towards this organization or how do they profit? Basically, who profits from the story that's being written in the way that it's being told. My question focuses a little bit more also on those sites that check things as true or false. I've also seen the ball kind of move that not only are they discrediting the so-called mainstream media, but they're discrediting the fact checker sites. And I've wondered in your research or in your work, if you had also seen this or the ways to talk about with people how those systems work.
Yeah, I hear a lot people just feeling like they can't trust anyone or anything. And that goes for the mainstream media, or, you know, however you want to say it, to those fact-checking sites as well. Fact-checking sites, again, will adhere to those same standards of quality journalism. And, you know, it's restoring trust, rebuilding trust is a long process that we're just one organization working to do that. And, you know, our approach is to kind of go back to those standards. And like you said, if it's a reputable, standards-based fact-checking outlet, there should be transparency. You know, there should be a way to see who is funding it, who is making money, who works there. You know, the Snopes article that we looked at for Mr. Rogers, it had a byline, and I can go and Google that guy and find out who he is. Like I said, I now work with him, so I know him and I know he's legit. But if I didn't, you know, I could Google Dan Ebon and find his Twitter and find his, you know, LinkedIn probably, and find his history and where he went to college and who is this guy. So there are ways that what we want is, you know, for people to have that healthy skepticism, right? And know how they can go and check that out for themselves. So that's how we're confronting that. But yeah, you're absolutely right about funding. That was a really good point.
Yeah, thank you so much. You took the bias map and you were saying that it's really, it's not 100% reliable because it depends on the standpoint of the person who's making the bias map. What other options do we have? I tend to fall on the cynical and hopeless side. And so I would love to know.
Yeah. Again, I think it comes down to, evaluating news. Part of the problem with the bias chart is that it kind of wraps up news and opinion into one when it makes those evaluations. So if a organization has an opinion page, basically they're going to fall somewhere. They can't be in the middle, is one thing that they say. And so in news literacy, we're kind of, one of the things that we are thinking about a lot, and one of the things that we teach about a lot is something we call info zones, which is different zones of information. So we have news, we have advertising, we have opinion, we have propaganda, and these are all different types of information that have different goals. And so it's a little harder to evaluate information like that, right? And the media bias chart is like a helpful shorthand, but what we want is for you to understand, when I'm looking at a piece of content, how to evaluate it so that I know what its goal is. And that will help me to evaluate where it might stand on that bias, right? If it's a piece of propaganda, yes, I'm going to expect that this is going to be very biased, and I'm going to respond to that in a certain way. Whereas if it's a news report, I know there are 7 standards I can look for and see if it adheres to that. You know, there are things I can check on a news organization's website, like who are the reporters? Do they issue corrections? Are they transparent about their funding? You know, so I guess what we are trying to do is to give you more of those skills internally so that when you see a piece of information, you can come to that conclusion on your own about how it's biased, why it's biased, and what that means for you. So we're complicating it, basically, but we're giving you more power, I think.
I have a really hard question.
Uh-oh.
Using your system, how could the American people have defended ourselves against the weapons of mass destruction conspiracy that was inflicted on us by what you're calling standards-based journalism?
Mm-hmm.
And how does manufacturing consent by power play into this?
So that's a great question. It is a hard question. Part of what news literacy seeks to do is, again, empower people to evaluate these pieces of information on their own. And also, we hope to hold standards-based news outlets accountable. It's a lot easier at the local level to do that because your local reporters you see in the grocery store, and you can talk to them about the story that they just published. And a big organization like New York Times or whatever is a little harder to approach. But what we seek to do is empower the consumer, where, maybe if we had some more of that critical observation or whatever, maybe we can approach these news outlets and say, hey, noticing some inconsistencies, hey, would really like you to check into this. And we think that a standards-based news outlet should, investigate that. I would say that it did work. It took a lot of time and mistakes were made, but we now have had some media criticism of the reporting that came out around that time, right? It took time, but we got there. Not perfect, but what we're seeking to give you and everyone who reads the news the ability to push back, to question, and to hold the media accountable. Like, that's part of what we have to do. And it's hard, like you said. So
Could you say more about the role of local media in all of this? I mean, I think for many of us, the news media we're familiar with for the most part now is these big national sources. How should we think about the role of local news?
yeah, a lot of recent polling and data shows that while trust is declining in national institutions and big news outlets, national news outlets that we are consuming so much of, trust is declining in those institutions, but people do maintain trust in their local organizations, which is kind of sad because at the same time, those local organizations are just facing a lot of cuts. Corporate ownership has really stretched small news outlets, independent news outlets, well, at one time, independent news outlets, like the paper I used to work for. We worked really hard. We were local people in your community, still are. I shouldn't speak in the past tense, but it's past tense for me. That's why I'm saying that. But my experience there was that, like I said, people could find us in the grocery store. People knew where our office was and could come in and talk to us. They could call us on the phone and we would answer. And I think that's really, really important. And what has happened for a variety of reasons is that local organizations like that have faced funding cuts and therefore have had to shrink their staffs. And as a result, we have less coverage. We have less quality of coverage. We have more user-generated content, which is something we can get on social media. So the role of local news is really important because it's still trusted. But at the same time, it's struggling. So I would say anyone concerned about that should absolutely invest in local journalism where they can, to the best of your ability. Support a local news outlet that is standards-based, that has a staff you trust. That's the best thing we can do. There's also a lot of philanthropy out there that seeks to support local news startups and nonprofits, and that's another great way. That's a way I hope we'll see more of that in rural communities like ours in the future.
As like the world transitions from traditional journalism to digital journalism, how do you see news literature transitioning into that, even in the next 20 years?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So one thing that we're focusing on right now is AI, right? Everybody is kind of worried about the kind of proliferation of artificial intelligence, which can create a deep fake video and image in moments, right? And while this technology is new and scary, what we're finding is that the same news literacy skills can apply to those and keep you safe just the same. You can use those same standards of journalism to evaluate a source. Typically, standards-based news outlets are not sharing AI-generated content without saying that it is AI-generated. There has been some AI illustrations used in the Atlantic, for example. They're labeled as such. But if you see, one example recently was a photo of Biden and Obama in hot pink suits, around the time the Barbie movie came out. So if you see something like that, again, we can use reverse image searching. We can look at the source. Okay, if I see that on social media, what is the page that's sharing that? a lot of the times these AI photos that circulate as if they're real are, satirical and stripped of context. If you trace them back to their source, they're usually from a page called Cursed AI. So again, it's just looking at the source, which is the same thing that we do in news literacy. We can apply that to AI content. And so, I kind of think about it as like low-tech solutions to high-tech problems. Yeah, the technology is new, but the skills that we use to evaluate that information is not new, and we have those skills.
Other questions? Yeah.
Back to types of bias, one of the things that you'd gone over was how often, was it how often how much you would cover a topic or not cover a topic, that type of thing. And with something, for example, like the Trump and criminal charges, things like that, at what point does it become, how would you, I guess, in your previous job as a editor, have to draw that line? Like where was it that you would have to be like, this is too much of this, even though it's just, this is most of what seems to be happening? And then how would you, I guess, check yourself on that? Because it has to be difficult.
Yeah, that's a good question. What you're referring to, I think, is that big story bias where you see wall-to-wall coverage of something that maybe only affects a couple of people. The example that comes to mind right away is the submersible, that the accident that happened this summer, that affected like a very small amount of people, but yet was like huge news for days and days. So it's kind of like that big story bias. And you asked about how I would confront that in my job as a journalist, and there are several ways to do that. There are several ways that we evaluate newsworthiness, is what we call it. And so that there are several factors that come into that, like how many people are affected, how unique is this experience or this story. So there are a series of kind of different things you can check to determine whether something is newsworthy. One of those being, like I said, how many people are affected, and is it about somebody who's very powerful, for example? These are all things that can play into it. And in my experience, the thing that I found really helpful was having, a newsroom with several people in it that could all get together and talk about that, right? We all bring our own perspectives. Like I might really care about the Titan because I'm a huge Titanic fan and I love submersibles and I'm just really, really interested in that. Whereas, my colleague may say, well, today there was actually something else that happened that affected like hundreds of people. It was a major incident. Maybe we should think about that instead. So I think sometimes what we need is that like collaborative spirit in a newsroom. And that's like not a very academic answer, but that's like the answer from my experience of, that's part of the work that journalists do in a newsroom, is get together and talk about these big questions and kind of check and balance each other. So that's really important.
So I have a question about which comes first, facts or values? What I mean is, we're thinking about restoring trust and a shared sort of basis of factual information. Is the answer just to get better facts, more reliable, better sourced, etc., or do we also need to reestablish a sense of some kind of shared social values that can help build a sense that we're all trying to do the same thing? I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think it's a little bit of both. And yeah, which came first, I don't know, but I think they very much play into each other. There are, pieces of our curriculum that talk strictly about fact and critical observation and evaluating things on these like very logical basis, right? But we also talk about values, that kind of civic duty part of it. We have lessons that talk about the importance of the Black press, which I would argue is very much both, right? These are facts, matters of facts, but also matters of values, the things that like the Black press was doing at a time when reporting was unfair. And, you know, big news outlets were dominated by white editors and white reporters, and that had consequences for Black communities, and their response was to create their own press. And you know, so to me, lessons like that are part of our curriculum very much deal in both. And that goes for, you know, the importance of the First Amendment too, is part of what we teach. And yeah, that's a value, absolutely. And without that value, I don't think we have the facts, right? Like if we don't have the you know, a free press, if we don't, you know, have the appreciation for the First Amendment, we don't have those facts. We don't have the journalism that we need to evaluate our values, essentially.
Watching my step counter here.
Okay, hi, thanks for the talk. I do appreciate the importance of news literacy. One concern that I have is regarding the First Amendment, and that is I guess the debate between whether the First Amendment rights of a platform like Facebook outweigh the First Amendment rights of people giving their perspectives on Facebook. Because there seems to be a frequent instance of like leftist news sources being taken down, while right-wing news sources often seem to be permitted to continue operating. So I'm wondering if there's a concern just regarding the platforms themselves, and if there's any worry of implicit kind of censorship and bias being protected by the First Amendment in those kinds of cases.
Yeah, it's kind of funny you should say that. I think if you ask anyone who works at a, you know, Republican affiliated media, they would say the opposite. They would say conservative content is policed way more than liberal content on platforms. Obviously, things are kind of always in a state of change, and yeah, it's very much up to these platforms how they want to deal with it, and that's part of how things are structured. I'm going to go back to a news literacy kind of backbone, which is that, again, when it comes to matters of who should things be censored, we would say no. It's up to us to be able to evaluate the information we're receiving and make decisions based on that, you know, that critical reasoning and things like that. So when we talk about censorship, we absolutely say no. When it comes to social media platforms, I think it's important to understand, again, the goals of social media platforms. They're designed to make money for the people who run them. They're designed to keep you scrolling. And that should play into how you consume the information that you find there, right? So that's part of news literacy as well, is understanding algorithms, understanding technology, and how that plays into the information that comes in and how it comes in and why and what we do with that once it does, right? So yeah, I think that, you know, where we teach is to look at understanding those algorithms, and that helps us, you know, better evaluate the goal and the information that we receive. So.
All right, please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you all.
So I encourage you all to check out the Center for Dewey Studies website and follow us on social media to learn more about the events that are going to come up and in the future. This is the first of our Dewey Dialogues public lectures, and that lecture series seeks to highlight local experts, practitioners in their field, and topics of both contemporary relevance, public relevance, but also that continue the legacy of John Dewey. I think this is a great start because it did all three of those things. Future Dewey Dialogues might emphasize one or two of them more than the others, but that's the mission. We also have a series of lunchtime talks that we'll be announcing some new lunchtime talks coming up soon. Lunchtime talks feature more academic work in Dewey studies and studies of American pragmatism and American philosophy. We have other events, including conferences and workshops coming up in the coming years. So please follow us online. If you have any feedback about this event, you can also email us. It's deweycenter@siu.edu, or you can find it on our website. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I hope we see you again soon. Wonderful. Thank you so much.